The prairie wind was a liar. It whispered of freedom, but it only brought dust and loneliness to Martha Keene's doorstep. She was 19, with a dying brother, a failing ranch, and a secret hidden in her barn that would get them both hanged. The man concealed in the hay was a bleeding Apache, and in Drywood Creek, harboring the enemy was a death sentence. But as her brother's lungs filled with fever, Martha was about to discover that the only thing more dangerous than the man she was hiding was the man who was hunting him. The Arizona Territory was a brutal, unforgiving canvas, and the Keene Ranch was a tiny, defiant brushstroke against it. It was 2,000 acres of dust, rock, and hope that was quickly turning to ash. Martha Keene watched the red sun bleed into the western mesas, her hands raw from lye soap and splintered wood. At 19, she felt ancient. Her brother, Thomas, was inside. The sound of his cough was the ranch's new rhythm, a dry, racking percussion that echoed Martha's own fear. Thomas was 17 and had inherited their mother's weak lungs and their father's stubborn pride. Both were poor currency in Drywood Creek. Their parents had been taken by cholera 3 years prior, leaving Martha as the sole proprietor of a failing cattle ranch and the sole guardian of her brother. The townsfolk in Drywood Creek, 10 miles of bad road away, watched her with a mixture of pity and predatory patience. They were all waiting to see when she would break, when Frank Brody would finally absorb her land into his own sprawling empire. Sheriff Frank Brody was the law, but he was also their neighbor. His land bordered theirs on 3 sides, a constant looming pressure. He was a man carved from granite, with eyes as cold and flat as a frozen pond. He'd made no secret of his desire for the Keene's watering hole. He'd made polite offers, then veiled threats. Now, he just watched. This evening the air was different. It was thick with more than just the impending dust storm. There was a metallic tang of violence on the wind. Martha pulled her thin shawl tighter. Earlier, at Henderson's general store, the talk was of nothing else. An Apache raiding party, they said. Hit a supply wagon bound for Fort Grant. Stole rifles. Killed 2 drivers. "Sheriff Brody's formed a posse," Mr. Henderson had told her, his voice low as he weighed her meager bag of flour. "They're hunting 'em. Brody, he ain't in a mood for prisoners." Martha had hurried home, the words hanging over her. The local Apache tribes were ghosts, spoken of in whispers and curses, blamed for every lost cow and dry well. To the people of Drywood Creek, they were not human. They were problems. As darkness fell, the storm hit. It wasn't rain. It was a wall of grit and sand that scoured the paint from the small clapboard house. The wind shrieked, a living thing clawing at the windows. Inside, Thomas coughed until he was breathless, his face pale and slick with sweat in the lamplight. "Martha," he whispered, his voice a reedy rasp. The wind. It's loud. It's just a storm, Thomas. Go to sleep." She smoothed his damp hair, her heart a cold knot of dread. Doc Hemlock had been by last week. "Lung fever," he'd proclaimed, stating the obvious. He'd left a bottle of foul-smelling laudanum that did nothing but dull Thomas's mind, and a bill that Martha couldn't pay. "I'll check the livestock," she said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. The 2 milk cows and 3 horses were their lifeline. She grabbed the heavy lantern and her father's old coat, leaning into the wind as she forced the kitchen door open. The world outside was a chaotic, roaring void. Sand stung her face, instantly blinding her. She kept her head down, following the rope line she'd strung between the house and the barn. The barn door was hard to pull, the wind sucking it shut. She slipped inside, the relative quiet a sudden relief. The air was warm and smelled of hay and animals. The cows lowed nervously, the horses stamped in their stalls. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice stolen by the wind hammering the roof. Just a storm. She moved to check the latch on the high loft window. That's when she heard it. It wasn't a cow. It wasn't a horse. It was a groan, a low, human sound of pure agony, nearly lost in the howl of the wind. Martha froze. Her blood ran cold. Drifters were common, but this was different. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. She raised the lantern. "I've got a shotgun." Silence. Only the wind. She took a step toward the back stalls, where they kept the winter hay. The lantern light cut a weak, yellow cone in the gloom. She saw nothing. She must have imagined it. It was the wind. It played tricks. She turned to leave. Another groan. This one was sharper, followed by a wet, choking sound. She whipped around. Her heart was in her throat. She moved slowly, her boots shuffling in the scattered hay. She lifted the lantern high, peering over the third stall. And she saw him. He was slumped against the far wall, half buried in the loose hay. He was Apache. His black hair was matted with blood and dirt. He wore buckskin leggings and a torn cotton shirt, dark with a stain that was unmistakably blood. His right shoulder and side were a ruin. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of pain. Martha's first instinct was to scream. Her second was to run. Her third was to raise the lantern higher. He couldn't have been much older than her. 20 maybe. He was strong, or had been. Now, he was bleeding out in her barn. He was one of them, one of the raiders Sheriff Brody was hunting. His eyes snapped open. They were black, deep, and filled with a defiant fire, even as his body failed him. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his hand weakly gripping the handle of a knife still sheathed at his belt. He was cornered, wounded, and ready to die fighting. Martha stared at the blood pooling on her hay. She thought of Sheriff Brody's cold eyes. She thought of the hanging tree outside the Drywood Creek jail. They would hang him. And if they found out she'd seen him, let alone helped him, they would hang her too. Or worse, they'd burn her out. They would take the ranch. They would take Thomas. Thomas. Her brother was dying in the house. This man was dying in her barn. The wind howled as if demanding a choice. Martha looked at the gaping, ugly wound in his shoulder. She looked at his face, contorted in a silent battle against pain. He was not a problem. He was a man. "Lord, help me," she whispered. She set the lantern down. Don't move, I'll be back." She fled the barn, her mind a storm as chaotic as the one outside. She had just sealed her fate. Martha burst back into the kitchen, slamming the door against the wailing wind. She stood panting, her back pressed to the wood, her mind racing. A raider. A killer. In my barn. She looked at Thomas, asleep in his cot by the fire, his breathing shallow. If Brody found him, Brody wouldn't just arrest him. He'd kill him where he lay and likely burn the barn down for good measure. He would ask questions later, and the answer would always be, she was harboring him. She had to get him out, tell him to leave. But where? He'd be dead by morning. The posse would find his body, track his bloody trail right back to her property. There was no good choice. There was only the choice she had already made. Her hands, of their own accord, were moving. She stoked the fire, put the heavy kettle on. She tore strips from one of their few clean bedsheets. She grabbed the bottle of whiskey her father had kept for medicinal purposes. She found her mother's sewing box, taking the largest needles. What am I doing? What am I doing? She went back out, leaning into the screaming sand. When she re-entered the barn, he was in the same position, but his eyes were tracking her. The fire was gone, replaced by a dull, feverish glaze. He'd lost more blood. I'm not going to hurt you," Martha said, her voice shaking. She set her supplies on a clean barrel. That bullet has to come out." He said nothing. He just watched her, his hand still on his knife. "You try to stop me, you'll die," she said, finding a sliver of new, hard steel in her voice. "You let me help you. You might also die, but it's a better chance." She held up the whiskey bottle. "This is going to hurt." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. For the next hour, the barn was a pocket of hell. Martha, who had only ever mended fences and sewn quilts, became a field surgeon. She poured whiskey onto the wound, earning a terrible, shuddering gasp from the man. She poured whiskey down her own throat, the burn giving her a reckless courage. She took her father's skinning knife, heated the tip in the lantern's flame until it glowed, and whispered, "I'm sorry." She had to probe for the bullet. The man's body arched in a silent scream. His teeth gritted so hard she thought they would crack, but he made no sound. He did not cry out. His control was terrifying. She finally found it, a flattened piece of lead, lodged against the muscle. Her stomach turned, but she worked the knife, her knuckles white. The bullet popped free, clattering into the tin basin she'd brought. The man slumped, unconscious. "No, no, no!" she panicked. She pressed her ear to his chest. A heartbeat. Faint, thready, but there. She packed the wound with the last of the whiskey-soaked rags and bound it tightly with the bedsheet strips. His side was a deep gash, likely from a rock or a ricochet. She sewed it shut with clumsy, large stitches, her hands covered in his blood. When she was done, she collapsed against the stall, shaking so violently she dropped the needle. She was exhausted, terrified, and implicated. She couldn't leave him on the floor. He'd freeze. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she dragged him, not into a stall, but up into the hayloft. It was the only defensible, concealable place. She dragged him up the ladder, step by painful step, his dead weight nearly pulling her down twice. She made him a bed in the deepest, darkest corner, behind a fortress of hay bales, and covered him with old blankets. She brought him water. He had drifted back to consciousness. He drank greedily. She left him there, returning to the house as the first grey hint of dawn bruised the sky. The storm was passing. She scrubbed her hands until they were red, burned the bloody rags in the stove, and hid the whiskey bottle. When Thomas woke, she was sitting by his bed, darning a sock, as if she had been there all night. "Martha?" he rasped. "You look tired." "Long night," she said, her voice hollow. Storms passed. The secret began to eat at her. For the next 3 days, her life was a fractured, frantic dance. She would tend to Thomas, forcing broth and weak tea down his throat. She would smile, tell him stories, and read from their mother's Bible, all while her mind was in the barn. Then she would slip out to feed the chickens or mend the fence. She would climb the loft, carrying a small tin of broth and a canteen of water. He was healing. With the animal vitality of the truly wild, he was healing. The fever that had gripped him broke on the second day. He never spoke. Not one word. He just watched her with those dark, unreadable eyes. She didn't know his name. He was just the man in the loft. She would dress his wounds. He would eat the food. A silent, dangerous contract. On the 4th day, as she brought him a piece of bread, she heard it. The sound she had been dreading. Hoofbeats. More than one. She froze at the base of the loft ladder. Her heart stopped. She looked up. The man in the loft had heard it too. He was already moving, melting back into the shadows, his hand on his knife. Martha forced her legs to move. She walked out of the barn, squinting into the bright, cold sun, smoothing her apron, praying her face wasn't as white as she felt. Sheriff Frank Brody was reining in his horse, not 10 yards from her. He was alone. "Mornin', Martha," he said. His voice was casual, but his eyes were not. They swept the yard, missing nothing. "Sheriff," she said, nodding, her throat tight. "Just checking on folks after the storm. You and Thomas fare all right?" "We're fine, Sheriff. Just fine. The storm, it was loud, but no damage." Brody swung down from his horse. He was a tall man, and he seemed to block the sun. He walked toward her, his spurs ringing on the hard-packed earth. "That's good," he said. He stopped, too close. He looked past her, at the barn. "Still hunting those renegades. Found one of them. Dead. About 5 miles north. Gut shot." Martha willed her hands not to tremble. "That's, good news, I suppose." "It's a start," Brody said, his gaze fixed on the barn door. "The one we're looking for, the one who killed the driver. He's wounded. Shoulder shot. Left a trail of blood, right up until the storm hit. Storm washed it away." He looked back at her, a slow, assessing gaze. "You ain't seen anyone suspicious round here, have you, Martha? A drifter, maybe?" "No one," Martha said, her voice miraculously steady. "Just me and Thomas. And he's very sick, Sheriff." "Heard that," Brody said, his expression unchanged. "Shame." He took a step toward the barn. "Mind if I check your barn? Sometimes they like to hide in the hay." It wasn't a question. Martha's world tilted. Of course not, Sheriff." She walked with him, her legs feeling like wood. "He's going to find him. He's going to kill him. He's going to hang me." Brody entered the barn. The warm animal smell seemed to mock her. He walked past the stalls. He looked at the floor, his eyes sharp. Had she missed a blood stain? He stopped at the ladder to the loft. "What's up there?" Just old hay, Sheriff, from last season. Barely any left." Brody put his boot on the first rung. He started to climb. Martha's heart was a drum against her ribs. She could hear nothing but her own blood roaring in her ears. He reached the top. He stood there for a long time, his silhouette dark against the light from the loft window. Martha could see the dust motes dancing in the air. She couldn't breathe. She heard a rustle of hay. Brody reappeared at the top of the ladder. He climbed down slowly. He walked back into the sunlight, his face a mask. He dusted his hands on his trousers. "Lot of hay up there for barely any," he said. We keep it for emergencies," Martha stammered. Brody stared at her. A long, cold, calculating stare. He knew she was lying, or he suspected it. He just didn't know why. "You take care of that brother, Martha," he said, swinging back onto his horse. "Land like this. It's too much for a young woman alone, especially one with so much sickness in the house." He touched the brim of his hat and rode away, not looking back. Martha sagged against the barn door, her knees buckling. She had survived. She ran to the loft. The man was gone from his bed. For one wild second, she thought he'd vanished. Then she saw him. He had wedged himself into a tiny, dark space between the sloping roof and a stack of rotted bales, a space she didn't even know existed. He was perfectly still, invisible. He slid out, his movements fluid, silent. He looked at her. He knew, without her saying a word, how close it had been. For the first time, his eyes held something other than pain or defiance. It might have been respect, or it might have been an acknowledgement of a shared debt. He stayed for 2 more days. On the morning of the 7th day after his arrival, Martha went to the barn with water and the last of the bread. The loft was empty. The blankets were neatly folded. He was gone. He had vanished as silently as he had appeared. Martha felt a strange, conflicting wave of profound relief and a sharp, sudden sense button of loss. She was safe again. But the secret remained, a new ghost to haunt the ranch. The disappearance of the Apache stranger left a vacuum in the small ranch. The terror of his discovery was gone, but so was the sharp, daily focus that had distracted Martha from her other, more insidious problem. Thomas was getting worse. The lung fever had settled deep in his chest. His breathing was a constant, wet rattle, a sound that filled the tiny house day and night. He was too weak to sit up, and the fever burned him, leaving him drenched in sweat despite the cold drafts that snaked through the floorboards. Doc Hemlock came, took Martha's last silver dollar, and shook his head. "It's in the Lord's hands now, Miss Keene," he'd said, his breath smelling of whiskey. "Keep him comfortable." Comfortable was a luxury Martha could no longer afford. The man's visit was a hollow formality. He offered no medicine, just a platitude. Desperation began to claw at Martha. The secret she had kept was a heavy, useless weight. She had risked her life, her ranch, and her brother's safety for a man who had vanished without a word. She felt a rising tide of bitterness. She had saved him. And for what? He had left. And now she was alone with a dying brother. The larder was almost bare. She was down to a sack of cornmeal, half a bag of beans, and some salt. The cows were still giving milk, but Thomas could barely keep it down. The credit at Henderson's general store was cut off. "I can't, Martha," Mr. Henderson had told her last week, his face pained. "I truly can't. Sheriff Brody was in, reminding me about your father's outstanding debts. He's put the pressure on. My hands are tied. Brody." It always came back to Brody. He was squeezing her, waiting for her to fail, waiting for Thomas to die so he could swoop in and claim the land to settle the debt. Martha was trapped. One afternoon, Thomas woke from a fitful, fevered sleep. His eyes, usually a bright blue, were milky and unfocused. "Martha?" he choked out. "I'm here, Thomas, I'm right here." She wiped his forehead with a damp rag. I had a dream. Mother was here. She was making her elderberry syrup, the one for the cough." Martha's heart broke. Their mother had been a firm believer in herbal remedies. Her elderberry syrup, thick with honey and herbs, had been a winter staple. But the elderberries grew high up in the foothills, a half-day's ride away, and she had no honey. She had nothing. "I remember," Martha whispered, forcing a smile. "It was good, wasn't it?" "It made it stop," he whispered, and a racking cough seized him, leaving him breathless and blue-lipped. That night, Martha didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair, the shotgun across her lap, watching her brother fade. The ranch, the land, the debt. None of it mattered. Only the rattling sound of his breath. She prayed. She prayed to a God who felt as distant and cold as the stars. She cursed Sheriff Brody. And in a dark, secret corner of her heart, she cursed the Apache man. He had taken her bandages, her food, her whiskey. He had taken her last reserves of courage and paid her back with absence. He had used her and left her to face the end alone. The next morning, Thomas wouldn't wake. His breathing was so shallow, she had to put her hand over his mouth to feel the faint, hot puff of air. This was it. He was slipping away. A cold, hard numbness settled over Martha. She had fought, she had scraped, she had lied, she had committed a crime, and it was all for nothing. Her world was shrinking to this small, cold room, to the cot where her only family was dying. She stood and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the harsh, beautiful land that had betrayed her. The sun was rising, painting the mesas in shades of pink and orange. It felt like a mockery. She was so lost in her grief, she didn't hear the footsteps until they were on the porch. Her head snapped up. Her blood turned to ice. Brody. He'd come. He must have known. The vultures in Drywood Creek had sharp eyes. He'd come to watch the end, to be there when she finally broke. She grabbed the shotgun, her hands shaking with a mixture of grief and pure, undiluted rage. She would not let him in. She would not let him see Thomas like this. She stalked to the door and pulled it open, ready to tell Frank Brody to go to hell. It wasn't Frank Brody. Standing on her porch was the Apache man. She stared, dumbfounded. He was not the wounded, broken creature she had hidden. He was dressed in clean leggings and a simple tunic. His shoulder was bandaged, but he stood tall. His face was stoic, his black hair tied back. He looked strong. He looked powerful. But he was swaying on his feet. He was covered in sweat and dust. He had clearly traveled far and fast. He held no weapon. His hands were open. In one, he held a small, intricately beaded leather pouch. Martha was too shocked to speak. All the bitterness, the anger, the sense of betrayal, it all washed away, replaced by a stunning, breathless confusion. He looked past her, into the house. He heard it, the shallow, rattling breath. His eyes met hers. He didn't ask permission. He stepped past her, pushing his way into the small house. What are you doing? Martha finally found her voice. Get out! You can't be here! He ignored her. He walked straight to Thomas's cot and looked down at the dying boy. His face remained impassive, but his eyes were sharp, analytical. He looked at the pale skin, the blue lips, the faint rise and fall of his chest. He turned to Martha. He opened the leather pouch. Inside was a collection of dried herbs, roots and powders. The smell that hit her was strange, earthy and sharp, a mix of pine, sage, and something she'd never smelled before. He pointed to the kettle. Water. Hot. It was the first time she had ever heard his voice. It was low and rough, heavy with an accent, but clear. What is that? Martha asked, her hand still on the shotgun. What are you doing? He is he said, using a word she didn't know. He pointed to his own chest. The breathing. This is medicine. Zith, li, na, o, dith. It works. I can't. He looked at her, his gaze pinning her. You saved me. Now. I save him. It was a simple statement, a payment of a debt. Martha looked at Thomas. He was so still. Doc Hemlock had failed. Her God had failed. She had nothing left to lose. She put the shotgun down and moved to the stove. What do I do? A new energy filled the small cabin. It was no longer a death room. It was a sick room, a place of work. The Apache stranger, Martha still didn't know his name, moved with a quiet, purposeful efficiency that was mesmerizing. He had her boil water, but not in the kettle. He had her use her smallest, cleanest iron pot. Into it, he crushed a combination of dark, brittle leaves and a pale, fibrous root from his pouch. He had her bring the water to a boil, then let it steep, covering the pot with a wooden plate. While the tea brewed, he took a different set of herbs, a bundle of dried sage and something that looked like crushed juniper bark. He had her fetch the rendered lard she kept in a crock. He mixed the herbs with a large dollop of lard in a small bowl, warming it slightly by the fire until it became a pungent, aromatic salve. Take shirt off, he commanded, gesturing to Thomas. Martha hesitated, but the authority in his voice was absolute. She gently unbuttoned Thomas's nightshirt, baring his thin, clammy chest. His ribs were stark under the skin. The stranger scooped up the greasy poultice. His hands, which Martha had only known to be weak or clutching a knife, were surprisingly gentle. He began to rub the salve onto Thomas's chest, his hands moving in a firm, circular motion. The room filled with the sharp, clean scents of sage and pine. He didn't just rub it on, he worked it into the skin, massaging the muscles between the ribs, over the breastbone on his back. It was methodical. He never looked at Martha, his entire focus on the boy. When he was done, he had her rebutton the shirt. Then he took the pot of tea. It was a dark, greenish-brown color, and smelled even stronger. Sit. Him. Up. Together they lifted Thomas. The boy's head lolled back, his eyes closed, but a low moan escaped him. Drink, the stranger said, holding the tin cup of tea to Thomas's lips. Thomas couldn't, or wouldn't. His lips were clamped shut. Thomas, Martha pleaded, her voice cracking. Thomas, please, you have to drink. It's medicine. It's like mother's syrup. He didn't respond. The stranger looked at Martha. You. Do it. He handed her the cup. Martha took it. She put her arm behind her brother's back, holding him. Thomas, please, she whispered, her own tears blurring her vision. Don't leave me. Please drink. She tipped the cup. A small trickle of the dark liquid ran over his lips and down his chin, but then, as if sensing the moisture, his lips parted. He coughed weakly, and then a small, reflexive swallow. That's it, Martha cried. Again! For 10 minutes, they fought for every sip. It was a battle. Thomas would swallow, cough, and seem to choke, but Martha persisted, getting swallow after swallow of the hot, bitter tea into him. When the cup was half empty, the stranger nodded. Enough. They laid him back down. The stranger pulled the blankets up to his chin, and then he sat. He didn't pace. He didn't look restless. He sat on the floor, in the corner, his back to the wall, and he watched. Martha sat in her rocker. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the awful, rattling breath. An hour passed. 2. Martha's hope, which had flared so brightly, began to dim. Thomas's breathing hadn't changed. If anything, the rattling seemed louder. His skin was still clammy. It's not working, she whispered, the words like acid. The stranger didn't look at her. He just kept his eyes on Thomas. It works, he repeated, his voice a low rumble. Wait. Martha wanted to scream. She had let a stranger in, performed some heathen ritual on her dying brother. What if it was poison? What if she had hastened the end? Another hour. The sun was high. Martha must have dozed, her head nodding forward, exhaustion finally claiming her. She was startled awake by a sound, a new sound. It was a cough, but it wasn't the dry, hacking rasp. It was a deep, wet, productive cough. Thomas was choking. Martha leaped up, thinking he was dying. But the stranger was there first. He hauled Thomas onto his side, thumping him on the back. Good, he grunted. Out. Get it. Out. Thomas convulsed, and a great, terrible gout of sickness and phlegm erupted from his lungs, soiling the blankets. Martha cried out, horrified. But then, Thomas took a breath. It wasn't a rattle. It wasn't a wheeze. It was a deep, shuddering, clear intake of air. His eyes flickered open. They were still dull, but they were focused. He looked at Martha. Martha, he whispered. His voice was a raw croak. I'm so hot. He was burning up. The fever had spiked. It's the medicine, the stranger said, his face still calm. It fights. He dipped a rag in the water bucket and handed it to Martha. Now, wait. For the rest of the day they fought the fever. The medicine was having a violent, profound effect. Thomas was no longer passive. He was restless. He thrashed. He sweated through the blankets. He muttered in a delirium. But he was breathing. The stranger had Martha force more of the tea down his throat every few hours. He reapplied the salve twice more. He was a constant, quiet presence, watching, waiting. Martha was no longer afraid of him. She was in awe. He had come back. He had brought life back into the house. As evening approached, the fever had not broken. Thomas was exhausted, but his breath was still clear. Martha was stirring the last of the cornmeal into a thin gruge, her hands shaking from exhaustion. She looked at the man in the corner. He hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. "You saved him," she said, her voice thick. I thought he was gone." The stranger just nodded. "He is strong." "Why did you come back?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her. "You were free. You were safe." He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. "You did not call the sheriff. You gave life. I give life. It is the ingehar." "The what?" "The debt," he said, simplifying. "It is paid." As he said the words, the dog, a half-starved hound Martha kept, let out a low, warning growl from under the porch. Martha froze. The stranger was on his feet in an instant, his entire body tense. He looked at the door. A moment later, they heard it. The jingle of a spur, a hard, heavy fist hammered on the door. "Martha," a voice barked. "Open this door. I know you're in there." It was Sheriff Frank Brody. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Martha. She looked from the door to the stranger. Brody. He was here, and the Apache was trapped. The stranger's hand went to his knife. His eyes darted around the small cabin, looking for an exit. There was none, only the one door and the two small windows. He was a wolf in a snare. "Martha, I said open up!" Brody roared, and this time the fist on the door was accompanied by the heavy thud of a boot. He was trying to kick it in. He will kill you," Martha whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The stranger's face was grim. He looked at the shotgun resting by the fireplace. He looked at Thomas, who had been startled awake by the noise and was watching with feverish, frightened eyes. The stranger made a decision. He would not be taken. He grabbed the shotgun. "No!" Martha hissed. "Don't! That's what he wants!" She ran to the door, pressing her back against it, as Brody slammed his weight into it again. The wood groaned. "Sheriff, stop!" she yelled. "You'll break the door." "Then open it, girl. I'm in no mood for games." "What do you want, Sheriff?" she cried, her voice high with panic. "I've got questions for you. Questions about who you've been entertaining." Martha's blood ran cold. He knows. He must know. Maybe he'd found a track. Maybe one of the gossips in town had seen the stranger arrive. I don't know what you mean," she stalled, her mind racing. "The hell you don't! Open this door, or I'll put a bullet through the lock." "You can't," Martha shrieked. "My brother, he's sick. You'll kill him." There was a pause. The shouting stopped. Martha could hear the heavy, angry breathing on the other side of the door. "He's sick, huh?" Brody's voice was dangerously quiet now. "That's what you said last time." Behind her, Martha heard a click. The stranger had cocked the shotgun. He was standing by Thomas's cot, aiming the barrel squarely at the door. He would kill Brody the second he came through, and when that happened, they would all be dead. The whole town would ride out and burn the ranch to the ground. "Don't," Martha whispered to him, her eyes pleading. "Please let me." She turned back to the door. She had to take control. She was no longer the frightened girl. She was a woman defending her home. "Sheriff Brody," she said, her voice dropping, shaking but firm. "My brother has the lung fever. He is gravely ill. You are frightening him. Whatever you have to say, you can say it through the door, or you can come back tomorrow." "I'm not coming back tomorrow, Martha. I got a report. Deputy Miller's boy. He was hunting rabbits up in the foothills. Says he saw an Apache. Said he saw him coming this way." Martha's heart hammered. Deputy Miller's boy. "He's a child," Martha said, grasping at straws. "He probably saw a shadow. He saw him clear as day, and he saw him come right onto your land. Now I'm going to ask you one last time. Are you harboring that renegade?" This was it. The moment. The lie. Behind her, the stranger watched her, the shotgun steady in his hands. He was leaving the choice to her. Martha closed her eyes. She thought of Thomas's clear breath. She thought of the 7 days she'd hidden this man, and the way he had returned. She opened her eyes. "No." Her voice was clear. "There is no one here, Sheriff, but me and my dying brother. Now, for the love of God, Frank, go away. Go away and let him die in peace." She had used his first name. She had never done that before. The silence on the other side of the door stretched for an eternity. She could picture him out there, his hand on his revolver, his mind working. He didn't believe her. He knew she was lying. Bang! A gunshot exploded, so loud it shook the house. Martha screamed. Thomas cried out. The stranger didn't flinch, but the bullet hadn't come through the door. It had been fired into the air. "This ain't over," Brody bellowed. His voice was thick with frustrated rage. "You mark my words, Martha Keene. I'll know the truth. And when I do, may God have mercy on your soul, because I won't." They heard his heavy boots stomping off the porch. They heard his horse gallop away, its hoofbeats fading into the night. Martha sagged, sliding down the door until she was sitting on the floor, her entire body trembling so hard her teeth chattered. The stranger slowly, carefully, uncocked the shotgun. He set it back by the fire. He walked over to Martha. He stood over her, a tall shadow in the dim, fire-lit cabin. He didn't offer a hand. He just said, "You are Ndatin Laddie." What does that mean?" she whispered, looking up at him. "Strong heart," he said. He turned, not to Thomas but to the door. He picked up his small, beaded pouch, now almost empty. He tucked it into his belt. "You're leaving?" Martha asked, scrambling to her feet. "Now. He'll be out there. He'll be watching. He watches." "The house," the stranger said. "He does not watch the arroyo. I go now." "But, Thomas, what if the fever comes back?" He walked to the cot and looked down. Thomas's eyes were open, wide and lucid. The fever, which had been burning him, had finally broken. The thrashing had stopped. He was covered in sweat, but it was the cleansing sweat of a broken fever, not the clammy sickness. "He is Tananoil. He is well. The sickness is gone. Keep warm. Broth." He turned to Martha. "The debt is paid." He went to the door. He didn't open it. He listened. For a full minute, he was perfectly still, listening to the sounds of the night. Then, with a speed that defied belief, he slipped the latch, opened the door a crack, and was gone. Martha rushed to the open door. The cold night air hit her. There was nothing. Just the dark, empty prairie and the sound of the wind. He had vanished. She secured the heavy bar across the door, her hands shaking. She turned back to the room. "Martha?" She rushed to the cot. Thomas was looking at her. He was really looking at her. Who was that man?" he whispered. He was a friend, Thomas," Martha said, tears finally streaming down her face. She sank to her knees, grabbing his hand. "He was a friend." I'm so thirsty," Thomas said. Martha laughed, a wild, hysterical sound of pure relief. "Yes," she said, jumping up. "Yes. Water and broth. I'll make broth." For the first time in months, the small cabin was not filled with sickness or fear. It was filled with hope. The sun rose on a new world. Thomas Kuhn was alive. The fever was gone. The rattling in his chest was gone. He was weak as a newborn kitten, but his eyes were clear and he was hungry. Martha spent the day in a daze of joyful work. She made him cornmeal gruel, she helped him drink water. He slept, and for the first time, it was a true, healing sleep, not a feverish stupor. The miracle of her brother's recovery was so profound that it took a full day for the other reality to set in. The consequences. When Martha rode to Drywood Creek 2 days later, the change was palpable. She needed supplies. Thomas was recovering, and he needed real food. She had traded one of her mother's gold lockets to a traveling peddler for a few dollars. As she walked into Henderson's general store, the usual low hum of conversation stopped, dead. Mrs. Wallace, the town's primary gossip, turned her back so sharply her bonnet nearly fell off. Mr. Henderson, who had always had a kind word, suddenly found himself intensely interested in a stack of canned peaches. "Mr. Henderson?" Martha said, her voice small. He turned and his face was guarded. "Miss Keene, I need flour and some bacon and molasses if you have it." "Got the flour. Bacon too. No molasses till the new wagon comes." His voice was flat, all business. He wouldn't meet her eye. As he weighed the flour, Deputy Miller came in. He was a young man, usually quick with a "how do," but today he stopped when he saw her. He flushed, took off his hat, and nodded. "Ma'am." "Deputy," Martha said. He shuffled, clearly uncomfortable. I heard your brother, Thomas. I heard he's better." "He is," Martha said, a small, proud smile touching her lips. "The fever broke. That's a miracle, ma'am. Truly." He was looking at her with a strange expression, part awe, part fear. "Doc Hemlock told everyone that he was a goner." "Doc Hemlock was wrong," Martha said simply. The bell on the door jingled, and Sheriff Brody walked in. The air in the store crackled. Brody's eyes locked on Martha. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. His face was dark with a suppressed fury. He ignored her, turning to Henderson. "Got that new box of shells for me, Henderson?" "Right here, Sheriff." Brody paid his coin, then turned. He walked slowly toward Martha, his spurs ringing in the suffocating silence. He stopped in front of her. "I hear there was a miracle out at your place," he said, his voice a low sneer. "My brother is alive, Sheriff. If that's a miracle, then yes." Martha stood her ground, her chin high. "It's miraculous. What a bit of heathen witchery can do, ain't it?" he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. Martha's blood chilled. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do. You lied to me, Martha. You lied to the law. That thing was in your house while I was at the door. I was protecting my brother," she said, her voice just as low and hard as steel. "You would have come in, guns blazing, and terrified him into his grave." Brody's eyes narrowed. He was furious that she wasn't cowering. "I went back after sunrise, found his tracks, moccasins, heading south. He was there. You harbored him. You chose him over your own kind." "I chose my brother," Martha shot back. "That man, he brought medicine. He saved my brother's life, a life Doc Hemlock and you were ready to write off. You were so busy hunting a man, you didn't care about a boy." Brody's hand twitched toward his gun. For a second, Martha thought he might strike her, right there in the store. The hatred coming off him was a physical wave. "You've made your choice, Martha," he spat. "You're an Indian lover. You're trash, just like your pa, who couldn't hold his liquor or his land. This town, we don't abide by your kind." He turned on his heel. "Henderson, Miller, you see she gets what she paid for, but her credit is gone. Her word is gone. She's on her own." He stormed out, the bell jangling furiously. The silence he left behind was worse. Mr. Henderson slid her parcels across the counter, not meeting her gaze. Martha paid her money. She picked up her flour and bacon. As she walked to the door, her back straight, she felt the eyes of everyone in the store on her. They weren't just curious, they were hostile. She was an outcast. She had saved her brother, but she had lost her community. She had lost her reputation. She had lost her place in the world. Riding home, the silence of the prairie felt different. It was no longer lonely, it was isolating. She was an island. She got back to the ranch and found Thomas sitting up in the rocker, a blanket around his shoulders, staring out the window. "You were gone a long time," he said. His voice was stronger. "Town," she said, unpacking the food. "It took a while. Did you see Sheriff Brody?" Martha stopped her. She looked at her brother. He was thin, pale, but he was alive. His blue eyes were sharp, and they held the new, somber wisdom of someone who had walked to the edge of the abyss and come back. "I did," she said. He hates us now, doesn't he?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Martha said, her voice flat. "I think he does." "And the town?" "Them too." Thomas was quiet for a long time. He looked down at his own hands, thin and white. "That man, the one who saved me. He was Apache, wasn't he?" "Yes." "The one Sheriff Brody was hunting?" "Yes." Thomas nodded slowly. "And you hid him. In the barn." Martha's heart ached. She'd wanted to protect him from this. "Yes, Thomas. I did." She waited for the accusation, for the fear, for him to tell her she'd been wrong, that she'd risked them for nothing. Instead, Thomas looked up, and his eyes were fierce, mirroring the fire she'd seen in the strangers. "You did the right thing, Martha," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "You did the only thing." Martha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The tears came, not of sadness, but of release. She went to her brother and hugged him. "It's just us now, Thomas," she whispered. "Then it's just us," he replied, his thin arm wrapping around her. "That's enough." The following months were the hardest. Winter set in, and Drywood Creek officially shunned Martha. "Indian lover," they whispered. "Witch. Traitor." No one would speak to her. Mr. Henderson would sell her goods, but only for cash, and he charged her more than anyone else. Sheriff Brody just watched from a distance, a dark silhouette on a ridge, waiting for them to fail. But they didn't fail. Thomas recovered. His recovery was slow, but it was steady. The weakness seemed to have been burned from his lungs. By spring, he was mending fences and riding the property line. The ranch, which had been failing, began to fight back because they were. They were a team, a silent, efficient unit, no longer a girl and a sick boy, but a woman and a man holding their land by sheer force of will. One day, in late summer, Martha was clearing the hayloft. In the far dark corner where the stranger had hidden from Brody, her hand hit something soft. It was a small, beautifully beaded sheath. He must have left it. She ran her thumb over the intricate beadwork, a tangible link to the man who had changed her life. Just then, she heard a horse. She went to the loft window and saw a single rider. It wasn't Brody. It was Deputy Miller. Martha went down to meet him, her heart tensing. Thomas came out of the house, standing on the porch, his arms crossed. They were a united front. Deputy Miller reined in. He looked tired and desperate. "Ma'am," he said, twisting his hat. I ain't here on official business. I'm here, on my own." He swallowed, and his eyes were pleading. It's my boy, Willie, the one who saw—" "I remember him," Martha said. "He's sick, real sick," Miller choked out. "Doc Hemlock says it's the lung fever. Same as Thomas had. He's burning up. The doc, he gave up, Mum. He said there's nothing he can do." He looked at her, his face a mask of agony. "The whole town, they whisper. They say you know things. How did you save him, Miss Keene? What did you do?" Martha looked at this man, this deputy, whose son had almost gotten her killed. She could have turned her back, given him the same cold shoulder the town had given her. But she looked at Thomas, alive and strong, and then at the beaded sheath in her hand. "He didn't just get better," Martha said, her voice clear and strong. "He was saved by medicine." "What medicine?" Miller asked, his voice desperate. "Laudanum, quinine, I'll pay anything." "No," Martha said. "Not that kind." She looked up at the foothills. It was Apache medicine. Miller's face fell. It was one thing to ask a shunned woman, another to seek the enemy. I can't," he whispered, shaking his head. "Then your son will die," Martha said, not unkindly. "Just as my brother would have." She watched the internal war on his face, prejudice and fear warring with the love for his child. Finally the father won. "Please," he said, and his voice broke. "Please help me." Martha took a breath. I remember what he used. I watched him. I remember the smell, the sage, the pine bark." She looked at Thomas, who gave a single, strong nod of approval. "I can't promise anything, Deputy," she said. I'm not him. But I can try." As Martha went inside to get her coat, she tucked the beaded sheath into her pocket. She rode out with Deputy Miller, back toward the town that had shunned her. She wasn't an outcast anymore. She was a healer. She never saw the Apache stranger again. But his legacy was there, in her brother's strong breathing, in the sheath, and in the knowledge she now carried. The debt was paid, but the lesson, that courage meant choosing life, no matter its form, would live forever. The story of Martha Keene isn't one you'll find in history books. It's a real-life story, etched in the dust of the Arizona Territory, a testament to the fact that true courage often means defying the very world you live in. She was a woman who faced an impossible choice: let two men die or risk everything for a stranger. In the end, she didn't just save her brother's life. She saved her own soul, and in doing so, became a quiet, unheralded legend in a land that wanted her silenced. Her story reminds us that compassion isn't a weakness, it's the ultimate strength. Thank you for listening to this incredible story. If her courage and determination moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. These stories of quiet, real-life heroes deserve to be heard. So please share this video with your friends and family. And to make sure you never miss another story of history, karma, and incredible twists, be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We'll see you in the next one.